Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the second in this occasional series of Archive Centre podcasts entitled What the Papers Say. In fact, I think this episode should be entitled What the Recordings Say, as it's about one of our first digital audio collections. In 2019, broadcaster, producer and journalist Boni Sones deposited in the Churchill Archive Centre her recordings of interviews with female members of Parliament. Her initial accession comprised conversations recorded in 2018 for the centenary of the first female MPs, but to this she's since added additional material. She has also partnered with the Archive Centre in conducting a series of exciting video interviews with female parliamentarians entitled the Groundbreakers Project, which we are now looking to make much more widely available. So, Boni, welcome. I should say that you're
Thank you, Alan.
a fellow commoner at Lucy Cavendish College, a policy associate at the university's Centre for Business Research, and you hold an OBE for services to broadcasting and public relations. You've worked in the media your whole career, and you were a pioneer of podcasting, running your own women's parliamentary radio channel from 2007. The results of all of that hard work are now preserved in the British Library, the London School of Economics, the History of Parliament Trust, and here for the 2018 and later material. Collectively, of course, that's a hugely significant body of material, which you've also used to inform your own publications. So I wondered whether you would like to start just by telling us a bit about your own journey, the career path that led you to found Women's Parliamentary Radio.
Well, I think I've probably been known for thinking outside of the box. So I started in journalism in East Anglia in the late 1970s for the East Anglian Daily Times and the Ipswich Star, print journalism, which I'm very proud of. And back then, women wrote women's pages. And the then editor, Mr. Simpson, met me in the corridor and said, "Boni, how are you getting on?" I said, "I'm fine, Mr. Simpson, but I'm a bit bored writing the women's page." He said, "You grew up at Sizewell, didn't you?" And I said, "Yes, I did." He said, "Well, could you be our nuclear energy correspondent?" And that was the beginning of one of 8 roles I performed as being a correspondent in print, radio and TV journalism, including at the BBC in the Look East, where I covered local government and education. And then I went on to BBC News 24. So it's been an interesting and exciting career.
No, absolutely. And of course, we have a lot of nuclear energy collections here. So perhaps some of your early reports are filed in the Cockcroft or Chadwick papers. But of course, at some point, you took the leap to go off on your own and to set up the Women's Parliamentary Radio channel. How did that come about?
Well, perhaps necessity being the mother of invention. I'd worked for the BBC as a political editor in the East after being a correspondent, so I was one of the senior people in the Eastern region working for the BBC. I got made redundant after the 97 landslide election, which Labour won, as did other political editors, and I went into training, but also I noticed the trends that up until about 2005, only the terrestrial channels could broadcast through the web. Then the broadcasting laws were relaxed and independents were allowed to broadcast. People forget how recent it is that we're all allowed to have a voice through the web, whether in radio and broadcast terms or in TV. It was heavily regulated until about 2005, 2006. So Women's Parliamentary Radio became one of the first podcast broadcast as live channels in the UK, because we'd written a book on women in Parliament, and the women across party, from Harriet Harman to Theresa May to Sandra Gidley for the Lib Dems, they had wanted us to do something else because the book was received well, which we're all surprised about. So they asked what else we could do. So I piped up with colleagues, Jackie Ashley, Deborah McGurran and Linda Fairbrother, that we could set up a parliamentary channel just for women by broadcasting through the web. And that's how we became one of the first web as live podcasters.
And what were your hopes and aspirations for that channel at that point?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think the same as the aspirations for the book, Women in Parliament, which was to give women in Parliament their own voice. They'd been ridiculed, Alan, and it's well known they'd been ridiculed very badly. I think the media commentator Roy Greenslade said in the publication of this book, it led to him apologising in a column in The Guardian to the women. He said when he talked about Patricia Hewitt's dungarees, it wasn't the same as talking about Ken Clarke's hush puppies. So the women knew that we'd had the successful launch of the book, with them speaking for themselves about what life was like in Westminster and the misogyny they were subject to. And then when setting up Women's Parliamentary Radio, as I said, there were a team of us that I headed and financed, but the intention was to give women their own voice. And of course they were allowed their own voice. So we were very popular in Westminster amongst the women MPs because we allowed them to tell their story. We put the difficult questions to them, but we asked them courteously, what is it that you've been talking about this week and why? And often the issues were constituency level. It wasn't about the rows and the argy-bargy that goes on and that the lobby reports. It was about the very real things that were happening in their constituency that were impacting their constituents' lives.
So were there, looking back on it now and looking back at the body of material that you amassed, can you identify trends, themes? Can you see sort of changes over time?
Oh, I think people, yes, you can see changes, and I would be the first to say that perhaps they've achieved more than they give themselves credit for, because even in your recent Groundbreaker series, where we interviewed women who were in Parliament in the early years, like Margaret Beckett in the mid-1970s, originally Harriet Harman in the 1980s. Then we also did the Conservative women like Theresa May and Virginia Bottomley. She was in Westminster early for the Conservative Party, indeed one of the first Conservative ministers in the cabinet. But they would say, well, we progressed issues, but then it went back. That progress wasn't as linear as you might think it would be.
2 steps forward,
it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I think overall, seeing the women there on our screen, seeing them in Parliament and listening to the issues they were championing. I mean, if you take, for instance, in 97, women hadn't sat on the Defence Select Committee before. The Defence Select Committee discussed armaments. It began to discuss, families, servicemen's families and the accommodation they were housed in. And then, of course, you had the setting up of the all-party parliamentary group on domestic violence. There's far more collaboration between women in Westminster that happens in Westminster than they're ever given credit for.
Okay. And are there particular moments, particular interviews that you're particularly proud of or would want to bring to the attention of our viewers and listeners?
Well, let's start, because we have, as you say, all the podcasts are sort of catalogued in these books. But if we start, these are in your actual archives. And a lovely one was when the Labour women stepped down in March 2015 because they knew there was going to be a general election and they didn't want to continue. So we interviewed people like Joan Ruddock, Tessa Jowell, Hazel Blears, and then Joanne Whalley, Dawn Pramarello, Anne Maguire, Meg Munn, Sian James, and as I said, it was Jackie Ashley, Linda Fairbrother, Deborah McGowan and ourselves who did these interviews. But they were telling about their own progress in Westminster and what they thought they achieved. And for instance, Dawn Pramarello said, well, I didn't achieve as much as I wanted to, but I realised that you have to hand the baton over to other people. But the kind of issues they list are the same as the issues in your Groundbreaker series, which is the minimum wage. That was a big step forward for women, because women work part-time and they work in insecure employment. So the minimum wage was a big step forward, and Margaret Beckett, Harriet Harman pushed that forward. Then Tessa Jowell, the late Tessa Jowell, I know you have her papers, Alan, but Sure Start was another one, but also issues on the environment and issues in education. And I know when we talk about, women in Parliament in the 100th year of women being elected to Parliament. We've got some lovely broadcasts in your archive, but what was happening at constituency level was often very tough for women. So you'd had Sharon Hodgson talking about personal independence payments and trying to challenge welfare cuts that the Conservatives were introducing, or food insecurity. So while you might have, women have debated, and now there's been legislation, I believe, about women not being forced to wear high heels at work. Actually, the issues that were happening at constituency level were very tough for women, including the shocking one, Peter Kyle, in that year of 100 years of women in the vote, actually had a debate, or just before that, had a debate on sex for rent. So what we've tried to do as a team is capture the constituency level issues that women brought into Westminster, because their political lives are only spent part of the time in Westminster. They go back to the constituencies on a Friday, they hold surgeries, and that's where they get told the problems. And these problems often result in debates in Westminster, but also they result in debates in the smaller Westminster Hall, which was another achievement of the women in Parliament, that they could take these issues, and although it was a Westminster Hall debate, not in the larger chamber, the minister would have to come and answer. And I remember Sharon Hodgson says, that's all we need, the minister, because I can then, after the debate, say, can I come and meet you?
So you end up with a record of actually really quite significant social change, and a record of how that change was actually achieved.
That's right, as well as the issues they were pressing forward, like Joan Ruddock and the hours, so they didn't have to sit all night. Or, I mean, Hazel Blears told a lovely story. She was one of the ones who we did as the Labour women stepping down, but how when the Labour women first came in back in 97, they decided to take over the smoking room because it had been a sort of really dreary place. So what they did, where men sat around sort of politicking and the women felt very uncomfortable, so they actually got a family room, which was good for men too, and you could take children too, but they used to storm the smoking room on a Tuesday, drink pink champagne, and then sort of sit in there, so it didn't allow room for the men to come in and take it over. But even she said, actually, after Labour lost in 2010, they went into the smoking room when the men had taken it over again. So these changes are often incremental, and we know there are a lot of newspaper headlines now about behaviour in Westminster.
Still, it's a great story to tell, sitting underneath Churchill's portrait, and we can imagine him spinning in his grave.
Yes, it's definitely someone who might have used the smoking room.
What would you say is your greatest coup in terms of all of these interviews?
Well, it is really difficult because I know my colleagues, Jackie, Linda and Deborah, think the same. It's a great privilege to sit down and interview someone and get them to tell you their story. And as I say, we put the difficult questions, but we wanted to allow them a forum to speak. So I think, and it was definitely, as I say, when the Labour women are talking and you hear their voices. Tessa Jowell is very good. Tessa Jowell, she was sort of had a mental health background, but she was very good at discussing the impact on your family and your friends of being in Westminster and what you have to do. Joan Ruddock actually telling the story of when she got called in by Tony Blair to be told that she would be sacked as a minister. And he said, "I'm sorry, Joan, I've got to let you go." And she said, "No, you don't." But, these are good mentoring roles for women and anybody who's got a career. But there are some very nice ones. I mean, Theresa May was Prime Minister. This book is bonkers because what it shows in the year that you had, 100 years of women in the vote, Theresa May was also trying to push forward. She hadn't yet stepped down as Prime Minister. She did that later in the year. But she was trying to push forward her Brexit reforms and try and get her Brexit bill through. And of course, the dissenters, including Boris Johnson, were trying to vote these down. So why I call it a bonkers year, you had Labour and Conservative politicians, including Heidi Allen, sort of forming their own independence party. 7 of the 11 people who formed that party were women. So when it came to International Women's Day in March 2018, we interviewed them because they were setting up their own party. Normally International Women's Day, again, when you talk about progress on things like domestic violence, Jess Phillip reads out the list of women and children killed by men, the Counting Dead Women project. But there we were interviewing women, setting up new parliamentary parties because of the Brexit debate. So I think one of the lovely things we did in the Vote 100 year, which is in your... and in audio, you can go anywhere in Westminster. If you film, you have to get a permit. But this allowed, it's lovely and atmospheric, all that green benchy sound of Westminster. So Melanie Unwin and others, the curators in Westminster, had put on lots of events to celebrate 100 years of women in the vote. But there's a lovely one, podcast documentary where Dr. Lisa Cameron of the SNP and Joe Swinson, don't forget who became later the leader of the Lib Dems, we took them through Westminster right down into the cupboard where Emily Wilding Davidson hid at the night of the census so that she could be counted as having lived in Westminster. And you know, you hear us going down the steps. That's a lovely one. Another one was Joe Swinson. Do you remember? She took her baby Gabriel into the House of Commons to vote because she'd just given birth on being allowed a proxy vote because the women weren't allowed proxy votes, as I say, as well as representing issues of their constituency. They were also trying to reform Westminster. Now, I've got to be fair to all of them. Another event was when Theresa May spoke in Westminster Hall, and all the parties came. You know, you saw the women standing together to celebrate that. Well, I went round and interviewed them. And then I think one of the remarkable things, and I'm not sure this would happen today actually, but was when Theresa May and others got together and they set up, if you like, a debate where 100 women from over 80 countries came, and there's a picture of them on the front page there. But I'm not sure that kind of progress has been sustained. Clearly they did it through the Interparliamentary Union, but that was a lovely debate to sit and watch, where you had women from over 80 countries debating in our Westminster Parliament.
Well, you touch on a really interesting issue there, because I think, you know, one of the great things about your project is how right from the outset it is cross-parliament, cross-party. But of course things, I think, have become more polarised in the last few years. Do you think that is making it more difficult to have these sort of cross-party female parliamentarian initiatives?
Well, I'm really pleased you asked me that, because when we wrote the first book, we had Theresa May really stuck her neck out to say that she was a feminist. So the fact that, you know, we trailed the book in The Guardian, that's why the media commentator Roy Greenslade commented on it. But for the Conservative women to be saying they were feminists, they were opening themselves up to ridicule. Well, I wonder now, if you went amongst the Conservative women, including the leader of the Conservative Party, whether or not they would champion the fact that they were feminists. I think the agenda has changed. They might not want to say they're feminists, or they might want to say we're all feminists now. But would they really want to promote the feminist agenda? Theresa May did, and she often turned up at events by herself. You know, she would be the only Tory woman there, and it would be packed with Labour women or Lib Dem women. So I'm not sure people feel the same need to fly the flag for feminism. So yes, I think it has changed and it is more polarised.
One of the recurring themes in your answers has been the sort of innate misogyny that women have been combating, and how
red shoes, no knickers,
and how the advances have been incremental, and that, you know, that this has continued and presumably still does continue to some extent. It's true, of course, equally of the press lobby, I would imagine, as it is for the female parliamentarians themselves. How did you find it sort of creating this channel, and how much resistance did you get from the established press correspondents?
I would say we were greeted with suspicion, whilst we could work comfortably in there because lots of the MPs knew who I was and who Deborah, Jackie and Linda were, but we were greeted with suspicion We were a new broadcaster. They weren't sure if broadcasting through the web was going to implicate them in any way. But there was a chair of the lobby from GCAP Media called Brian Shallcross, now dead. But he saw what we were trying to do, and he got behind us. So the others, the mumbling stopped, should we say. They call it the Burma Road. It's not an easy place to work, the lobby. And then, of course, you had Carolyn Quinn from the BBC becoming chair of the lobby.
Yeah.
Well, that helped us a lot, having a woman chair from the BBC who understood what we were trying to do. But we were certainly greeted with suspicion to begin with. But then certain individuals came to our side, saw what we were trying to do. Was there resentment that we could phone up the women and get interviews very quickly? Yes, there was. But I think the integrity of the interviews and the quality of the interviews spoke for themselves. So it was very hard for them to criticise us. And also we were very transparent about funding. I funded it and how we operated. And that transparency really matters when you're in the lobby.
And that quality of the interviews that you've referred to, which of course is now preserved in the archive here and in the various other archives I mentioned at the beginning, the British Library, the London School of Economics, by the History of Parliament Trust, that body of material, of course, how would you like to see that being used?
Well, I would like to say that we've created something. The tabloid newspapers were often called names that represented, if you like, people that they thought weren't represented well in the media. So like The Sun, you're reflecting society back up. So I'd like to feel that we were, if people look through the archives, we genuinely covered the issues of the day that women were being told about in their constituencies and that they lobbied and campaigned for change. Now, these might be the issues, the bread and butter issues of changes that were going to be made to the welfare system, or something that's happened to their families. Knife crime would be a case in point. That people come, and not just to the women MPs as well, but they come to the MPs and there's a problem. And one of the great things is about Parliament, after you listen to PMQs on a Wednesday, there's the razzmatazz and the shouting. And I have to say, I have a lovely interview with Theresa May when she was launching Women to Win. And she was on the train back from Liverpool and she gave us an interview that was really good. And she always said, well, she'd stop, if she became Prime Minister, she'd stop the shouting at PMQs on a Wednesday. I have to say they never do. No. But if you let the shouting go down after 10 minutes, you'll find democracy is a wonderful thing. You'll find an MP popping up, perhaps from the opposition party, asking the Prime Minister a question. The issue they're asking the Prime Minister a question on is represented by a family who've experienced that issue, sitting in the public gallery. And the British Prime Minister, whoever they are, says, come and see me. Now, if you listen to the World Service at night and you hear what's happening in other countries, you realise how precious democracy is, that you can ask the British Prime Minister, whoever they are, a question on a Wednesday about a constituent's issue, and they say, come and see me.
So how then do you want to see archives like this one taking this material and using that material to spread that message?
I think what I'd like people listening, one, they're going to listen to them telling the story in their own voice. Yeah. As I say, the book and the podcast and the podcast channel were a riposte to the British media that were saying they're all no good. Oh, the women in Westminster, they're all no good. So you can let them speak for themselves. You can hear the passion with which they speak. You can hear them answering the difficult questions like the Dawn Pramarero. Did you do enough? No, we didn't do enough.
You can hear what they're passionate about, what they're angry about.
Yes, and as much, these interviews are often 15, 20 minutes long. And importantly, they were done, the archive world realises they were done in the moment. So the MP spoke in the chamber and we usually picked up on what they'd said straight after. I mean, one of the brilliant interviews that I think you've asked about it, was the debate when Margaret Thatcher had died. Ed Miliband was leader of the Labour Party then. He told the Labour MPs not to turn up. This was a debate to honour Margaret Thatcher's memory. Well, Glenda Jackson turned up. And the Labour colleagues behind her were sitting like this. And actually, she gave that famous speech, and there was no care in the community. Sharp elbows, sharp knees. Now, I don't mind interviewing a Prime Minister, interviewing Glenda Jackson after she's given a speech like that, you phone her up, you're not sure, and she says, yes, come along. And so there's an interview saying, had she written that speech out, why did she give it, why did she not stay away if she wanted to say something negative? But it was an important speech. And, your hand's shaking when you interview Glenda Jackson. She's got a very formidable intellect. But no, there's some lovely material in these archives, and I think it's quite spellbinding to hear them speak for themselves and to hear their voices, because that's so new. As I said, in terms of broadcasting, we're only 20 years into this revolution of being able to broadcast if you're not a terrestrial channel.
I think on that, Boni, I think that is the perfect note to finish on, because we can encourage our listeners now to actually go onto our website and to actually access this material and to do what you've asked them to do, which is to listen to these female parliamentarians speaking for themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you.